Hello and welcome back to The Forge, where you can get your regular dose of Realogy and reclaim your awareness. Thank you for joining us today for episode 7. And today is going to be the continuation of the series that we started. This is the character assassination of God by religion, and this is part 2 of a 3-part series. In part 1 of this discussion, we illustrated already how Jesus provides insight to a version of the Creator that is much more compassionate and loving than what we've been led to believe by religious institutions and in key events throughout the Old Testament. In parts 2 and 3, we will survey those Old Testament events along with influences from and connections to a small variety of complementary literature. We maintain that Jesus sought fervently to undo the resultant harm from believing in the vengeful, xenophobic, tyrannical version of God by giving a contrast in his actions that spoke louder than any words could do. The initial concept that Jesus opposed what we perceive as the Old Testament God by showing us the true character traits of the Creator is admittedly disruptive if you hold to the mainstream view when you first encounter it. So today we're going to dive even deeper into supportive texts to this concept. I caution those, once again, not ready to explore this concept to not watch this video if it helps maintain your sanity. In this video, we'll spend some time looking at Christian scriptures that detail characteristics and stories that are supposedly attributed to God that I personally no longer accept as such. And it's just as important that we state the unspoken truths inherent in these beliefs as we go through and discuss them. So we're either taught by others or sometimes we inflict it upon ourselves to not probe too deeply into questions that could change or challenge what you've been told to accept by church leaders. And as we start to state what must be true in order for our beliefs to be valid, we learn a lot more than we do by quiet acceptance. We find that a lot of the unspoken and supportive concepts necessary to enable our beliefs are concepts that we would not agree with if they were spoken and analyzed apart from the passage from which they're derived. We should expect some fallout from disturbing the very foundation of Abrahamic religions, but I also do find it kind of ironic that the foundation of religion in Abraham's birthplace provides us the tools to do so. Now, the viewer should understand that this is done in search of truth, of something better, and not with malicious or destructive intent. In humanity's ancient past, long preceding any person in religious leadership today, people embraced the dread sovereign, probably because it provided such a close reflection to their own internal biases and tendencies. This should have been the clue that something was wrong. While I was in the ministry, I learned that Israel, having been drawn to pagan worship like their neighboring nations, were punished for their disobedience when God sent their enemies to lead them into captivity in a foreign land. Now, the frequent recipient of this pagan worship, we were taught, was Baal. Upon returning to their homeland after the captivity, Israel and Judah sought to right their wrongs that led to those circumstances of their captivity. The prevalence of Baal worship was such that there were priests of Baal among the Israelites and religious writings to teach the tenets of their worship of Baal. We read in Hosea chapter 2 and starting with verse 16, "And it shall be at that day, saith the Lord, that thou shalt call me Ishi, and no more Baali." I think that's how you pronounce that. Verse 17, "For I will take away the names of Balaam out of her mouth, and they shall no more be remembered by their name." Also in Zephaniah 1 verse 4, "I will also stretch out my hand upon Judah, and upon all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and I will cut off the remnant of Baal from this place, in the name of the Chemarims with the priests." And we see from the text of Hosea, who actively prophesied during the captivity of the 10 tribes of Israel to Assyria in 722 BC, and that of Zephaniah, who actively prophesied between the captivity of Israel and that of Judah in 586 BC, that the people understood a desire of God to snuff out the name of Baal everywhere that it appeared. And that is just what they did. In contrition, Israel thoroughly purged their text of Baal's name and replaced it first with the understood name of God, Yahweh, and later with the title for God, Adonai, meaning the Lord, as a show of reverence by not speaking the name given to Moses, lest it be spoken in vain. As such, it is feasible to consider that some of the stories we now read as stories of Adonai, the Lord, were at one time read as stories of Baal, just as they were at one time read as stories of Yahweh. We know for a fact that many of the passages we read today that say the Lord used to say Baal's name in its place, and agree this is more likely a later revision than the original content. Although it's not common knowledge in today's religious circles, this was not the first time that a name shuffle occurred for the Hebrew God. We read in Genesis 11 and verse 31, the bolded portion, Terah took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And also in Genesis 15 verse 7, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees. We also see in Joshua 24 and in verse 2, your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in old time, even Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. And I took your father Abraham from the other side of the flood. We also read later in Joshua 24 and verse 14, now therefore fear the Lord. Put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt, and serve you the Lord. Choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Dropping down to verse 19, and Joshua said unto the people, you cannot serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions nor your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve strange gods, then he will turn and do you hurt and consume you, after that he hath done you good. Verse 23, now therefore put away, he said, the strange gods which are among you. Abram's family was called out from the land known as Ur of the Chaldees. Now in a previous video, we analyzed how the Hebrew scriptures state that the name of Babylon was called such because that's where God confounded the language of man. In other words, to say that to Babel is where the name Babylon came from. Now we stated that it would make absolutely no sense for the most powerful country in the world at that time to give itself a name that means to speak incoherently. Obviously, this is an independent Hebraic conclusion, and correctly identified at that time that the name recognized by the inhabitants of that land was actually Babylon, meaning the gate of God. Okay, the same is true of Ur of the Chaldees. Natives did not say they were from Ur of the Chaldees. They called it Sumer, Ur likely being a shortened form of that name, perhaps common to non-natives of the land. Now, the land of Sumer is where Abraham was born, educated, raised to maturity, met and married his wife before his family migrated to Canaan. Their descendants recorded that Yahweh called his family out, requiring them to serve him as their God, leaving the gods from Ur behind. However, as Abraham spent his entire life in Ur prior to migrating to Canaan, he can leave their gods behind, but it is impossible to leave behind everything his environment contributed to the person that he now was. Judaism and Christianity have accepted that God conveyed the Genesis creation narrative to Moses while they spoke on Mount Sinai. Now, between 1835 and 1896, though it was not widely known until more recent times, evidence was compiled that the Genesis creation narrative did not originate with Moses. It was handed down as oral tradition from Moses' forefathers, tracing back to Abraham's upbringing. Now, this is very inconvenient information because we find a significant number of the Genesis stories also appear in creation narratives discovered in Abraham's homeland, which were already in existence prior to his family departing from Sumer, and which quite plainly precede Moses' account in Genesis. Now, as the Sumerians were not worshippers of Yahweh, we find that these ancient narratives mention other entities in Yahweh's place. The two Sumerian accounts, the Enuma Elish and Atrahasis, plus the non-canonical Book of Enoch, deals with how these other entities traveled, their symbology, their capabilities, their names and titles, their lineage, their hierarchy, how they were regarded by and interacted with humanity. This places the events we witness later in the Old Testament in a much different light and provides a much better context for the doctrinal challenges we see coming from Jesus centuries later, as highlighted in part 1 of this series in episode 6. We're going to go about this study looking at what I've termed as the breathing pattern of biblical patriarchs and looking at some of the notable concurrent events that happen alongside them. I'm calling this a breathing pattern because at times you have a constricting of the story, sometimes just in name as far as in focusing on one family, and sometimes by actual genetic constriction, reducing the population down to a family or a group of people. like we have with Adam and Eve. Of course, the story starts with them as the first humans, and then the story expands to talk about their children and all of their descendants. The population and the story both focuses in again on Noah and his family during the flood, and then it expands again after that. We focus in again on Abraham and his bloodline down through Joseph and their children, and then the story expands again. Focus again on Moses, expands. Focus on David and Solomon, expands. Jesus and the apostles, and so on. So in part 2 of this series, we're going to just proceed to look at the narratives that would have existed prior to Abraham leaving Ur and going into Canaan. Those events are going to deal with the creation, other events prior to the Garden of Eden, the creation of the Nephilim and the sons of God. We'll look at Enoch's story, the story of the flood from 2900 BC, and the story of the Tower of Babel in 2800 BC. In part 3, we'll go through the remainder of the stories and all of the events that have happened, not all of the events, obviously, but some of the events that have transpired after Abraham left his homeland of Sumer, and looking at some of the events that his descendants have had and interactions they've had with their God in later stories. And we've touched briefly on alternative views on these events in a prior video, but here we're going to go a little bit deeper and focus on some of the more important details. As stated earlier, we will proceed in analyzing these events as popularly interpreted from the Bible by asking simple questions about what unspoken beliefs we hold in considering this version of events as accurate. And we will observe the mirrored version of these events in the Enuma Elish, Atrahasis, and the Book of Enoch, just to see what additional context is provided in this complementary literature. Now again, when we see this additional context, it's important to keep in mind these stories precede what we read in the Bible, okay? You're going to notice connections, you're going to notice likeness in terminology, you're going to notice parts of the story that seem to make more sense and fit better with the terminology than the version of events that we've been given. Before we continue, let me once again remind you of the intention behind this study. The series is about how the Creator has been mischaracterized by religion. I'm not attacking the scripture. I want to present the simple fact that these stories existed before Moses' account to make them move away from this problematic version of God easier. The Enuma Elish is the Babylonian or Sumerian creation epic, and it was taught to Abraham in his native land. Okay, that goes beyond question. In accepting this historical fact, it is evident that Moses thought the Sumerian account relayed from his forefathers was at least accurate enough to reference, perhaps seeking only to rectify the absence of the name that he knew God by. And when considering the additional context available and what is historically proven biblical source material, we find clarity in previously mysterious biblical sayings and stories. We must now recognize that these stories were never about the actual Creator whom Jesus proclaimed. And the act of devotion to scribble Yahweh's name into these stories had the unfortunate effect of giving God terrible mortal traits and skewing the perception of the Creator to all future believers. So let's begin. We'll start with the creation events and things prior to the Garden of Eden. And we're going to proceed in this format of looking at the lesson or the conclusion of whatever scriptural passage that we're taught. And then we'll look at what is the enabler, or what must be true in order for this belief to be so. This is what we're talking about for the unspoken truths, the things that we kind of quietly accept and don't question. And if we ask some of these questions, we will realize at times that the conclusion doesn't make sense, okay? Or that the things that must be true in order for the scriptural conclusion to be, those things don't make sense. Either the conclusion or the supporting concept. We're going to find that they have problems when we start to look at it in this format, okay? So we'll start looking at the 6-day creation process. What must be true for that is that all archaeological and geological science is useless, okay? Everything we have in the fossil record, everything about the age of the earth, the age of the universe for that matter, the fact that we're told that the universe is 14 billion years old, all these things that we're told scientifically have to be scrapped if we are going to accept and believe a literal 6-day creation process, a literal 6,000 years ago. The way this story is told, it appears that Earth is created just for man. Okay, what we have to accept, or what must be true for that, is that man must be the first and primary intended population, and that everything else is here for us to exploit. We have the lesson that God created man in his image and in his likeness. What must be true is that if mankind does not find itself side by side with God, We must know which characteristics are in bounds to confirm mankind has these actual traits. We're never specifically told. Obviously, we're not finding ourselves sitting side by side with God, so you can't just conclude it's everything or you can't conclude it's nothing. God says that there's going to be traits of his image, of his likeness that appear in humanity. If we're not specifically told, we're kind of left in the dark there. We also have the statement of let us make man in our image. And again, what must be true is that the speaker must be interacting with others who hold the same traits. Let us make man in our image and in our likeness. Okay, the speaker is interacting with others who hold the same traits that are being passed down to the creation. Hebrews were monotheistic for 2 millennia prior to Christianity, and they remain so today. So now we give the comparison of these same events as presented in the Enuma Elish, and this is read in tablet 5 of that work. So we address first the 6-day creation process, okay? In the Enuma Elish, we learn that the biblical creation order, again, the work that comes after, that this order follows the generations of the gods in the Enuma Elish. While creation days 1 through 3 are slightly reordered in the generations, regardless, God creates the heavens on the biblical 4th day. The 4th tablet is about the God of the heavens. God creates the oceans on the biblical 5th day. The 5th tablet is about the God of the oceans, and so on. So the days line up with the topic of each tablet, okay? The Enuma Elish includes hundreds of thousands of years of historical information preceding the 6,000 years allowed by a strict literal interpretation of the Bible. And this is consistent with archaeological and geological evidence. Again, accepting this narrative means we don't have to scrap everything that our scientists are telling us and everything that the data shows, okay? They can coexist. Next, we look at the conclusion of Earth being created for man, okay? And in the Enuma Elish, we get an interesting historical twist. The Earth is given a long and detailed history prior to humanity, okay? It tells the story of an asteroid belt that is the remnant of a planet that was between Mars and Jupiter, and that planet was called Tiamat, and it was nicknamed the Watery Monster and said to contain life. After this planet was damaged, the debris became the asteroid belt and remained in the original orbit, what's called the fate in the Enuma Elish. It stayed in the original orbit of the planet between Mars and Jupiter. The remaining part of that planet that was mostly intact was then knocked into our current orbit and is now known as Earth, or what's called Apsu in the Enuma Elish. This narrative explains the cluster of continents known as Pangaea and why the continents separated as the planet stabilized and recovered its spherical shape. In Atrahasis, Ea, also known as Enki, was described as acquiring for himself the entire sea's crater, a crater that was opposite the remaining landmass of Pangaea. So we have to kind of visualize a little bit here that if we had a planet that was hit by an asteroid and it was a watery monster, if part of that planet got sheared off, all the water fell into that crater, and that's why it's called the sea's crater. The water drained off the other side and left this big landmass on the other side. And as the Earth healed and recovered its spherical shape, the continent spread out, and then we no longer have that crater of the sea. We have the planet geographically laid out the way that we're used to seeing it today. We also address the let us in the Bible. Now, in the Enuma Elish, as a contrast, the Sumerians worshipped an advanced non-terrestrial race called the Anunnaki as their gods. The plan to create man was declared and executed by their god Marduk, with the support of the other gods, Ea, otherwise known as Enki, and Nudimmud, also known as Nintu, also known as Mami, who were the medical and genetic engineering collaborators with Marduk. Their plan was approved by the Council of all the High Gods. Okay, this council was known as the Elohim. This meant gods in the Babylonian language, and this was a plural word, and it literally meant the lofty or the powerful or the supreme ones, depending on who you ask. But this is what this word meant to the Sumerians: the lofty ones, the powerful ones, or the supreme ones. The Hebrews later adopted this word Elohim to identify their singular God. Now, remember, as we're talking through this, right, we talked about how God, in order to say, let us make man in our image and in our likeness, has to be talking to other beings that have the exact same traits that are being shared and passed down to humanity. That follows and makes better sense and is actually explained in the Enuma Elish. This is an explanation that we don't have in the Bible canon. Not saying that there's not an explanation to be had, not saying that people are without a conclusion or some statement that they make. What they do not have, what they do lack, is the clarity of the text explaining word for word what this really means to be made in our image and in our likeness. Okay? It's just something that we have in the Enuma Elish. Again, just providing the facts, providing the data, make your own conclusion from there. We next look at the lesson of man being in God's image. The Anunnaki genetically engineered humanity from evolving earth apes in their story and mixing in their own DNA. And this is how man is said to be in their image and in their likeness. The genetic material collected from the spilled blood of one who has been rebellious, whom Ea and Marduk executed, was used as genetic base material to create the humans. Now, thousands of years before the Hebrew creation account existed, the god Marduk was declared to be a shepherd to the entire people of his own making. He established temples and smoke offerings as tribute so that humankind would, quote, remember him and call him their god. He was also known in this text as the son or king of the gods, which is very akin to Lord of Hosts. The next biblical lesson we look at is in the Garden of Eden. Now, the lesson, Eve and Adam were made perfect and flawless from the start. Their transgression of eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was original sin, and it created a gulf between God and humankind. They forfeit their original nature. What must be accepted here is that humanity's original flawless state was without knowledge of good and evil, naked, and without the Holy Spirit. What also must be true is that ignorant creation overrode the perfection in the Creator's design. The next lesson, that God gives man free will, but punishes him for not doing God's will. What must be true is that man is punished for operating exactly as he's designed, and he's given free will, but punished for acting upon it. The next lesson we have is that God cursed the serpent for tempting Eve, even though it told the truth as confirmed by God. The serpent told Eve that in the day that you eat the fruit, your eyes will be open and you will be like God. And God's response later was mankind's eyes have been opened, and behold, they have become like one of us. Okay? So what must be true is that the serpent spoke, for one. And what also must be true is that Satan is either a serpent or a shapeshifter, because it says that he appears as this serpent. Now, this question must be resolved. It may not seem like it right now, but this question must be resolved in order to understand who the curses that are pronounced here actually apply to. Does it apply to Satan, or does it apply to the species of serpents? It says that they're confined to earth and they're restricted to traveling on their belly. Now, why is this important to discuss? Brief sidebar. Satan appears to God in Job. He's not described as crawling in his belly. He's also not described as a serpent here, but he is elsewhere associated with dragons, which are scripturally interchangeable with the word serpent. Second is, why would a serpent species be cursed in this way? Because Satan merely used its form if he is some kind of shapeshifter. If Satan took on your form and then lied to God about going to a party, would then an all-knowing God hold you or all of humanity accountable and be punished or cursed for another being taking your form and then lying about the devious acts that it performed while dressed up as you or in your flesh? Another point we have to consider, serpents have crawled around on their belly for 90 plus million years. Snakes as we know them now. But they don't speak, obviously. Now, some people say that this serpent narrative describes why snakes crawl around on their belly. So that would mean that either the Adam and Eve story is over 90 million years old. Okay, this is the predecessor story to why snakes crawl around on their stomach. The evolutionary record tells us that's been the case for 90 plus million years. Or Satan's true nature is that of a type of speaking serpent and not the snakes that we've envisioned all this time. Okay? Now, perhaps crawling around in his belly is a poor translation of a curse with an entirely different meaning, and we'll look at that shortly. The next lesson we'll look at is God's rest being interrupted. Okay? What must be true is that man's sin plus Satan's opposition are enough to derail God's entire plan. Okay? What also must be true is that God was either weary from the creation effort or he considered the work done for him to have a rest. And we'll look at why both of these really don't bode too well for the traditional narrative. But again, these are the things that we accept in accepting the scriptural narrative without any questions or challenges. Another sidebar. In 2 Peter 3:8, it teaches that one day with the Lord is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years as a day. Now, based on this verse, I was taught and taught others that biblically we're still in day 6. The days are not meant to be literal. Therefore, evolution science is not a threat. How do we justify this? Because in Hebrew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11, it very clearly states that God rests with his people. Okay? Biblically, God's seventh-day rest should not be considered past tense. God enters his rest only with his people and only after the plan is complete. So this explains why we had, in my church and the way I was instructed, that we're still in day 6, because the rest comes after the work is complete and God enters that rest with his people. But that the statement of God's rest was prophetic. Let me emphasize once again, this is not the mainstream conclusion. The mainstream conclusion is that God rested on the seventh day, seventh literal day. So what are you dealing with? Either a spirit, an all-powerful spirit or entity that is able to get weary from its labor. It should be understood that weariness from labor should be a physical condition, not a spiritual one. And if we're not talking about a physical entity, weariness from labor shouldn't even be a consideration. Maybe there's something that we're missing. Maybe there's something we don't understand about the nature of a spirit being. But in my mind, weariness from labor is a physical condition. Or an all-knowing God knows and sees the end from the beginning, but yet can't see on day 7 when he decides to take this rest that the work was not complete, that there was a challenge to soon arise, and that on day 8, some bad things are about to happen. Neither one of these bode very well for the mainstream conclusion. The next lesson we have from the Garden of Eden is that man was exiled from the garden, had to toil for food and travail in labor, and there was a prophecy of another who will bruise the head of the serpent. What must be true is that an all-knowing God did not foresee this. His plan A was a failure. Thus, he needed to recover from that event and needed a plan B to defeat the serpent. We also have to accept is that our labor and subjugation is our fault, which conveniently prevents rebellion, and also that we are dependent on another for relief, to bruise the head of the serpent, that we are unable to do this on our own. Now, we contrast these events with what we see in the Enuma Elish in Tablet 6 and also in Atrahasis in Tablet 1. In this complementary literature, God's rest here is tied to mankind's labor and travail. They're connected. In the Enuma Elish and Atrahasis, the Anunnaki were plundering Earth's natural resources. This work was very labor-intensive for a group of beings called the Ajiji, and they were a lower-ranking Anunnaki worker class. We also see Marduk make the declaration that my thought is to create a primitive human to be called man. The work which is now done by the gods, he will do, so that the gods will not be required to labor forevermore. These are direct quotes from this text. We also see the quote, we must create a creature who can carry the burden and perform the labor of the gods. They also have the quote, we have caused your burdens to be shifted onto mankind. This is obviously the Anunnaki speaking to one another. We also see Ea or Enki having approved the plan along with the council of the other high gods, and then related to him what he thought would bring the gods rest, the creation of man. After Ea had made humankind, he had him do the labor of the gods, another direct quote from the book. Also, Marduk is, quote, to set them, humans, to do the gods' work, that they, the gods, might have leisure. And then we also see the name Marduka declare the name of the god that made humankind, bringing blessings to the Anunnaki and freeing the Ajiji from toil. Also, we note that Marduk was said to be severe but kind, forceful but forgiving, very much the way Yahweh was just described in Joshua 24. We also see other connections here in this complementary literature, specifically concerning the serpent symbology and the serpent's punishment. Let's see if we can make more sense out of this narrative than we do out of the one that we've been given. Enki was the medical scientist. He was known as wise. He had a serpent symbol, and this symbol was likely the origin of the medical symbol caduceus, or the staff of Hermes. This symbol has serpents intertwined on the staff in the shape of a double helix DNA. Needless to say, we didn't discover DNA until a few decades ago. This was not known then. But he, together with Nintu, and the role they played in humanity's creation, considered humanity their people. Enlil, the brother of Enki. Enlil was a warrior. He was fierce. He abode with men. He considered humanity lesser than himself and his people, and at times he sought to annihilate humanity. Now, inside of 600 years after mankind was created, Enlil became agitated with the noise and the overpopulation of the human group. Enki collaborated with Atrahasis, otherwise known as Noah, to preserve him and his family, which angered Enlil. Later, Nintu decided to remain on Earth, this is after the flood, with humanity to protect them, thus cursing a medical officer, symbolized by the serpent, to remain cast down to Earth for helping mankind against the will of the gods, never being allowed to return to the Anunnaki home in the heavens. I think this is the context by which we have the story in the scripture of the serpent being cursed to crawl in its belly on the earth. It comes from this story where this being characterized or symbolized by a serpent helped humanity, gave humanity something that the gods didn't want, and for that was cursed to stay on earth, which would have been akin to crawling around in their belly, a lowly place compared to the Anunnaki home. They weren't allowed to go back home. Okay, so you could see that this curse of being forced to remain on earth could have later been interpreted as, being forced to crawl around in your belly for the rest of your days. It's also noteworthy that these gods agreed not to flood the earth again, only due to worry that mankind would consider these gods too malicious and then stop making offerings. Obviously, the meat sacrifices that we've inherited in our religions, obviously not being done today, but those sacrifices were simply eaten by those gods. We also have mankind's exposure to the knowledge of good and evil, as discussed in the Enuma Elish in Tablet 6. The Enuma Elish accounts of Marduk sending 300 Anunnaki officers to be guardians of Earth, which correlates with the events in the Book of Enoch and with Jewish oral tradition. It reveals a lot to us regarding the lasting impact of this Babylonian narrative on modern-day religion. Also, the Book of Enoch provides the name of the Watchers, who came from heaven to earth and taught mankind forbidden knowledge, which was intended to be reserved for the gods. These biblical angels, which were actually flesh and blood beings, not from earth in the Enuma Elish, were understood not to be the authorities calling the shots for their kind, but they clearly had power that left humanity in awe. Now, the gap between gods and humans in the Enuma Elish is really just good old-fashioned prejudice. The humans were created to relieve the god-class extraterrestrials of their labor, and they were not considered equals by the Anunnaki. Certain knowledge being held by humanity was deemed to be a threat to the social order, as we've seen enforced by other slave-owning regimes, and therefore making that knowledge known to mankind was illegal. Next, we look at the Nephilim, or the sons of God. The lessons we get from Genesis 6:2-4 is that the sons of God are angels, and that sexual intercourse with human women resulted in the Nephilim, or the giants. Okay? What must be true for this? It must mean that these angels, which are later called ministering spirits of fire, were somehow sexually and genetically compatible with human women. We also accept that the giants are angelic human hybrids. Let's think about this for a minute. We're believing that ministering spirits were engaging in sexual intercourse with human women, and that these giants we're told about are actually angelic human hybrids. Now, another brief sidebar in Genesis 6:2-4, the sons of God are contrasted with the daughters of men. They're compared in a way that insinuates that the sons of God are not fully human. Also in Hebrews 1 verses 5-7, the angels are spirits. Luke 24:39 says that spirits don't have flesh and bone. Now, we also see in that same passage that angels are not called sons of God, yet this contradicts another passage in Job 1:6 and 2:1, where he does call angels the sons of God, as well as Adam is called the son of God in Luke 3:38. So this is a term we do see used for others. Again, in terms of Adam, yes, he was a man. In terms of the angels, they were not. Okay, but I think that what's more important is the definition of angels as ministering spirits, and Jesus said that they don't have flesh and bone. So we must be talking about some other natured creature when we're referring to the sons of God here. Now, whatever their nature, they were apparently able to procreate with human women if the story is true, and I believe it is, but with a very different outcome than when human men and human women procreate. Human fathers carry a growth inhibiting gene. Okay, let's think about a liger. This is when a lion and a tiger mate and have an offspring. Now, female lions and male tigers both carry the growth inhibiting gene for their species. So when a male lion mates with a female tiger, the resultant offspring is larger than them both because these are the two parents that do not have the growth inhibiting gene. The same is true of the Anunnaki, our genetic predecessors, mating with human women. Without the human man there, the growth inhibiting gene is not there, and the resultant offspring grows larger. We also see the lesson of giants found in Canaan and identified as the descendants of Anak. What must be true is that the Nephilim are angel-human hybrid descendants, and also that they somehow survived the flood. The contrast that we see in the Enuma Elish in Tablet 4 and also in the Book of Enoch, referring to the Nephilim, the sons of God, or the Anakim, on the origin of the race of giants. And among these topics, this is by far the easiest connection to make from the Bible to the Enuma Elish. Marduk separated the gods into two camps. There were 300 to guard the heavens and 300 to guard the earth. In Genesis 6:4, the Nephilim, or the giants, are called the offspring of the sons of God, mating with human women. Numbers 13:27-33. After 40 days spying in Canaan, Israeli spies returned to report that the giants, the descendants of Anak, dwell there, and the Israelites are like grasshoppers compared to their stature. We also see in Deuteronomy 128, chapter 2, verses 10-11, chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, it refers to the descendants of Anak in the plural and calls them the Anakim. Okay? Now, giants in Genesis 6 called the offspring of the sons of God. Giants in Numbers 13 are called the offspring of Anak. The offspring of Anak, the offspring of the sons of God, these two terms are being used interchangeably. We have to ask ourselves, what's the connection? What did Anak and his sons do to be considered sons of God? We're told of everyone in Adam's lineage, everyone who was righteous, and yet I can recall no Sunday school lessons, because there were none, on the righteous Anak or his descendants. And if they're righteous, what exactly are they doing in Canaan, which the Israelites have been sent to destroy? Now, more in the origin. The genetic mutation of gigantism, as in the biblical Nephilim, is connected back to Anak's bloodline. Anak's people, the Anakim, is a clear reference, as clear as we can find, back to the Anunnaki gods of the Enuma Elish. The names are so familiar because it's referring back to the same group of people. The Anakim, the Anunnaki, referring to the same group of people. Now, if you believe the story of Goliath, and if you believe in the Bible, you've read the story of David and Goliath. If you believe the scriptures connecting his bloodline to the Anakim, who are the Anunnaki, then it becomes very difficult to deny this biblical link to the Enuma Elish. And the only explanation ever given, how giants are possible and why they were here. This genetic mutation is not resulting from angels and humans interbreeding. It's not possible. They were the result of the 300 Anunnaki officers who were genetically compatible predecessors to humanity, being sent to guard Earth, who found the daughters of men attractive and bred with them. They too were punished and exiled from returning to their home world. Remember the story about the 300 angels that were swept out of heaven and brought down to earth with Satan. You have a predecessor, you have more context and a baseline for all of these stories that we read when you look at these other texts here. This explains the interchangeability between the sons of God and the sons of Anak. The Anunnaki, or the Anakim, were considered gods to the Sumerians and the Babylonians. The sons of Anak would have been considered the sons of God to those people. The next lesson we have is on Enoch, and very simply just says Enoch was translated. We're really not given a lot about Enoch in the scripture. What we must accept as true is that he walked with God, as the scripture says, and then he was not. That's all it says. God took him. Okay, it's not really explained. Now, this book attributed to him is enlightening, and it's quoted in the New Testament, which to me lends credibility to the content, though some argue that the book of Enoch is a later writing and instead quoted the New Testament, not quoted in the New Testament, and they use that to argue that the work is fraudulent. But I think that there is enough other content there, as well as some of the more well-known Jewish oral traditions that come from this book and that we really don't see explained or given any details anywhere else. Now we look at the actual book of Enoch, and what does his book tell us that the Bible maybe does not? For one, it names the angels who were told are cast down to heaven, or the watchers who departed from heaven. 300 watchers, a third of the angels. You got to realize there's a connection there. But he names these beings regardless. Beginning from chapter 17, he describes an experience of being taken by these beings he considered angels. Now, it's interesting here that these angels are able to, as he says, take the forms of men. And he's shown things that indicate that he was taken around the world, into Earth orbit, and likely outside of our solar system by the way that he defines things. Now, I personally don't like the baggage of the word abduction. He was given advance notice. He was awake for his travels. He was communicating with them and in utter amazement of this journey and in gratitude of what he was being allowed to see. There's also lots of parallels to Ezekiel's experience, which we'll look at in the next episode for part 3. We also look at the lesson in the lessons concerning the flood and the story of Noah. In this lesson, this is an interesting one. God destroyed the entire population of the earth except for one family. What must be true? God sent the flood to destroy wickedness, but wickedness reappeared very soon after the flood. Okay? Nothing is achieved by wiping out 99.9% of all human life. Was God guessing that the flood would work? And if the flood was God's answer, why was it so ineffective? We have to ask these questions. We don't think about these things when we're told the stories. We march on. As I mentioned in the prior video, it's kind of robotic. You know, you're downloaded this code and you take that code and you carry it on to your destination. We have to stop sometimes and ask ourselves these questions, because if we don't, the truth or the gaps in these stories won't appear. So what do we get from Noah and the story of the flood in the book of Atrahasis? The flood is very simply not effective because it's not a divine plan. It's disaster prep, okay? As stated earlier, the Sumerian version of the flood epic is named after its protagonist, Atrahasis. He's better known by Noah in the Judeo-Christian circles, even though his name is closer to Abraham's name. I think there's still questions and maybe some challenges there about whether this was really maybe a story of a different character. Regardless, we know him as Noah in Judeo-Christian circles. And this complements the narrative in the Enuma Elish. Instead of God responding to unrighteousness, these books tell the story of Enlil growing frustrated with the noise and rapidly increasing population of humans. The Anunnaki scientists were able to detect a pending global catastrophe, and they evacuated themselves to allow a reset of the human experiment. You're not looking at a divine plan to rid the world of wickedness. You're looking at cruel people, cruel flesh and blood beings that knew there was an extinction level event coming to this planet and wanted to reset the population. Wickedness appeared right after that because there was nothing done by God to stop wickedness. Enlil's brother Enki took a liking to Noah, and he looked favorably on most of humanity as he was personally invested in his own creation. Enki committed treason by not only warning Atrahasis about the coming catastrophe, but also telling him how to survive it by building this ark or this boat. Now, what's unexplained is that the Nephilim persisted after the flood. Okay, did Noah's daughter-in-laws carry the Nephilim gene? Did the Anunnaki continue to procreate with humanity? Or was the effect of the flood localized and not worldwide as we're told, and maybe it failed to devastate all human and or giant lives? I personally think when you read the Atrahasis story, Enlil comes back down and he's angry with the fact that Noah survived, and they're still on the planet. And I think that if they're still on the planet, it's very likely that their troops are still interacting with humanity and still causing the development of giants. And I think that's why they persist after the flood. The Bible says they persist after, but it doesn't give an explanation as to why. If the flood was worldwide and killed everybody but Noah's family, his daughters either carried the gene, daughter-in-laws either carried the gene, or they were still around and still doing the same thing after this event. We also see that Enki's treason caused a rift between he and his brother Enlil. Now, what's interesting is that Enlil being the warrior, Enki being the medical officer symbolized by the serpent, this cemented a narrative prior to Abraham leaving Ur of the serpent symbol, Enki, who helped mankind, being punished for helping man against the will of God. Enlil felt his brother committed treason by helping humanity when the council of the high gods that they belonged to all decided and agreed they would let the humans get wiped out and they would start over. So what Enki did to help humanity basically amounted to treason in the eyes of his people. And he wasn't, he was also punished for this. But again, this cemented this narrative we see later on of God punishing the serpent for helping humanity. And the last event we'll look at in the last lesson comes from the Tower of Babel. And the lesson is that God confounded the language of man for collaborating for making a name for themselves and to build a tower to reach the heavens. What must be true to enable this lesson? Mankind was punished and separated for working together, only to be called by God to unify again later. What also must be true? Mankind has since built skyscrapers. We visited the moon. We've had much bigger accomplishments, and if I'm being honest, much bigger offenses than what was done then, and there's been no divine response. I'm not saying this to challenge God or to ask that God come down and punish us for these things. Just listen to the story, listen to some of the counterpoints, and you'll understand why I think this is an important point. But we have to seriously consider we are in the same place or past that in the internet age. We're able to communicate very nearly the same way, and we've had much bigger accomplishments. We've done a lot worse things, and there hasn't been a divine response. We look at the Tower of Babel explanations even in the Bible. Okay, this was a response to human ambitions at Babylon, okay, which was the gateway of the gods. Now, Babylon was named such because it was a location, and we get this from the Enuma Elish, that it was a location of either a spaceport or a portal. I know it sounds very sci-fi, but this is what's in the text, okay? I'm just reporting out the reality of what these texts say. You don't have to believe it, but it's interesting nonetheless as it exists as a historical narrative, and you can read it on your own, okay? The response was not in anger over man's arrogant construction ambitions. It was a military response to an incursion at a facility that, if overrun, would have granted human access to the Anunnaki homeworld. The division of mankind by language effectively removed the threat of human access to this military facility. The confusion of language was feasible because we're dealing with a very advanced civilization who's already been responsible for genetically engineering the human race. A neurological type of attack to cripple human communication would not be very difficult for them to accomplish. Now, it's here that we received a brain capacity downgrade, perhaps one preventing the type of telepathic communication that we see making a resurgence in more modern times. And it's relegated us to purely spoken language, which cannot remain constant over the vast area that humans had already settled at that point. Now, I also believe that this explains the significance of another biblical event that, while often marveled, I've never heard sufficiently explained. When Luke describes in the book of Acts, cloven tongues of fire sitting over the heads of those present on the day of Pentecost. I personally believe the explanation is that this symbolizes some sort of healing action regarding maybe mental communication being imparted by the true creator, either communication back with the creator or that would have improved human communication with one another. I don't know, but I think that that's the significance of the symbols that we see there. And again, it's never really explained in the Bible. But I believe that this is where we see, again, the true creator coming in with compassion to humanity and working to undo the effects of some of these things that have been done to us. Now, in parts 1 and 2, we've reviewed Jesus' words within the Bible itself, and we've looked at complementary ancient literary works to understand how God has been mischaracterized by religion. We have to consider what ancient humanity lacked when these documents were initially written. Namely, they lacked the technological and the biological vocabulary to describe what they observed. They lacked the capacity to challenge this murderous presence they had come to know as God. They lacked the experience and the awareness of the truth about our reality as we've now come to know it in modern times. Their lack, coupled with our trepidation to revisit their observations with a modern-day lens, has resulted in unreconcilable conclusions about what they witnessed and what they've experienced. The mere existence of these documents, which predate our biblical accounts, the fact that we know this is what Abraham was taught before departing Earth, the fact that Abraham's descendants retell the same basic events thousands of years later, with much less detail and a different cast of characters. By these things alone, at the very least, we have to consider that we've had an incomplete context, at the least, an incomplete context of the biblical events that the Jews inherited. And if we accept that those early passages have been given to us with the wrong context, we simply must ask the question of whether later events were also interactions with the same Anunnaki beings, or with a different non-terrestrial group, or did they finally really interact with God? And it is with this in mind that I challenge this problematic version of a God with mortal attributes of jealousy, ego, he's xenophobic, a lack of regard for life, at times without love and compassion, able to get weary from labor, not able to perceive design flaws within its own plans, thus repeatedly adjusting to new challenges as they arise. Not omnipresent, but traveling to and from different places in vehicles, and reigning over a powerless and terrified population as a dreaded, genocidal, and tyrannical monarch or group of monarchs. The character traits we see in Jesus displays more integrity and compassion for mankind than the God given to us by religion. That's because it was actually a very flawed, flesh and blood race of Anunnaki that they actually interacted with and not the Creator. I choose to believe that our Creator is far greater than the one we've seen in our religious works. We must conduct an honest and introspective analysis of our own thinking and our belief set that has resulted from this flawed version of God that we've been given. So in part 3, we'll conclude this part of our journey with a common sense approach to the remaining Old Testament passages, documenting divine encounters which occurred after the Enuma Elish was written. I consider these people honest and intelligent. I'm not challenging what they say. I don't think they were lying. Okay, I don't think they wrote lies. I don't think they had an intent to deceive. I think they did the best job they could to convey to us what they experienced during their lifetime. So we'll simply have another look with our own more complete context now, because hindsight is 20/20. There is more to come. I thank you for joining us for episode 7 and part 2 of this series. I invite you to join us back again for episode 8, where we will conclude this study on the character assassination of God by religion. Thank you for joining us. And until next time, remember, seek truth, reclaim your knowledge, your existence, and your reality. Thank you.